Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin, on Lake Michigan. It is a difficult place to get to. To reach the island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island, drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, and then take a passenger-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bicycles are allowed on Rock Island, although the island is relatively small, about 900 acres. It has an interesting history. In the early 17th century, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other and had a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part, they lived peacefully together on the island. By the 1640s, the Potawatomi had moved on to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after the Potawatomi left the island, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They appeared to be more white settlers, but wore strange clothing and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to speak to any of these new settlers or find out where they lived. At this time, strange things began to happen in the village. Several animals, possibly pigs or chickens kept by the settlers, were found slaughtered. Markings were made with their blood on some buildings in the village. Another night, a building used for curing meat burned down. The villagers were convinced that these new people on the island were responsible and wanted to find them. However, after a search of the woods, which included the forested interior of the island, not a single person was found. These strange occurrences seemed to stop shortly after the search, and none of the other settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. Upon completion of construction, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported that the material from which the lighthouse and the dwelling were built was of quality, and the work was done in a solid and workmanlike manner. David E. Corbin was appointed the first lighthouse keeper on December 19, 1837. Just 3 years later, in 1840, despite the alleged quality of the construction, Corbin began to complain. The plaster began to fall off the walls and some kind of liquid seeped through the cracks, so the house was constantly damp. Corbin was alone in the lighthouse most of the time, and some visitors reported that he sometimes stared at a certain wall and spoke vaguely of other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude in the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and found that while Corbin was performing his duties, he seemed strange. The official report states that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave to find a wife to live with him in the lighthouse. However, some believe that the inspector was frightened by Corbin's state of mind, caused by years of isolation, and thought it would be best if Corbin spent some time off the island. In 1852, Corbin allegedly fell ill and died in the lighthouse in December of the same year. He was buried in a small cemetery south of the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported a surprisingly rapid deterioration of the lighthouse. Friends who visited the new keeper said he spoke of strange things he saw in the house at night, but he wouldn't elaborate. In 1858, after only 22 years of use, the original lighthouse was demolished and a new one was built. From that point on, it was a regulation that lighthouse keepers had either an assistant or a family living with them in the lighthouse. Aside from strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, no other strange occurrences were reported in the lighthouse logbook, except on January 20, 1876. The lighthouse keeper at the time, named Betts, reported seeing 2 men attempting to return from the mainland of Washington Island in a rowboat. A terrible storm broke out after their departure, and the men never reached their destination. More than 3 months later, on May 3, 1876, Betts wrote in the logbook, "The two men lost last January have been seen several times, once from the lighthouse and once from Jackson Harbor. The men were apparently sitting upright in the boat, frozen stiff, surrounded by a large mass of ice. At the last report, they were still drifting, and there is little hope that they will be found and buried." By 1900, most residents had left Rock Island to live in better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful businessman and inventor named Chester Thordarson bought almost the entire island, with the exception of the area where the lighthouse stood in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Thordarson is responsible for some of the unique and mysterious buildings and structures that still stand on the island today. At the southern end of the island, he had a large stone hall built, which had a boathouse in the lower area. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was erected at the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store Thordarson's immense book collection, over 11,000 books. It is rumored that he also owned some very rare books on the occult. Thordarson died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, although some speculate that he may have seen something that literally scared him to death. However, I could not find any writings by Thordarson mentioning that he experienced anything strange on the island. After Thordarson's death, several universities showed interest in his book collection. However, he bequeathed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison on the condition that they buy it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history is hard to find on the internet, but there are a few binders in the Great Hall that document much of it. Thordarson's personal papers are in the archives of the Wisconsin State Historical Society. All this history just serves to provide a little context for the experiences I had directly or indirectly on Rock Island. In August 2020, I took my first and last trip to Rock Island. After 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at 2:00 p.m. I had booked Remote Campsite E, a backpacker campsite located about a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking to my spot to enjoy the scenery and took a few breaks because my backpack was quite heavy. I had packed more for camping than for hiking. When I reached my spot, I set up my tent, got everything ready, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach to make a fire. On my third trip back from the beach, just before I got back to my spot, I heard a single high-pitched squeal coming from the woods. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stood rooted to the spot and waited 30 seconds to see if it would repeat. It didn't, so I continued back to my spot. When I got back, I started lighting my fire. The remote campsites on Rock Island are quite far apart. Sites C, D, and E are grouped, but there is probably about 100 meters between each site. There is no real path connecting the sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the 3 sites that there is an obvious trail. As I was arranging some sticks in the fire ring, something caught my attention. I looked up and saw a person walking in my direction some distance away, possibly near Site D or a little further. My first thought was, that's weird, because as I said, there isn't even really a path there. Then I thought maybe something was wrong and this person needed help. The person got a little closer, and it looked like it might be a woman in loose gray clothing, maybe a hoodie. She was still far enough away that I couldn't make out details. I stood up quickly from the crouching position I was in, and just at that moment I heard that high-pitched squeal again. It came from behind me and was much closer this time. It scared me quite a bit, so I turned around to look into the woods behind me. I scanned the trees for a few seconds, but I couldn't see or hear anything. When I turned back around to look for the walking person, she was gone. I stood there scanning the area with my eyes but couldn't find her. Anywhere, I was so confused and froze for a few seconds. It was all very strange. I told myself it must have just been another camper from Site C or D, maybe running to the pit toilet located a few hundred yards west of the sites. I tried to forget the whole thing, but it really bothered me. I didn't like that squeal, and it just felt weird. With some effort, I decided to let it go and started my fire. I ate a quick meal, had a few alcoholic drinks, and then decided to take a little walk. I hadn't seen sites C and D yet, so I thought I might explore them and find out if I had neighbors nearby. Site D was empty. However, I saw the trail leading from Site D to the main trail and the pit toilet, which reassured me a bit because I thought the walking person might have taken an unusual route to get to the main trail by walking through Site D. It didn't make much sense because I should have seen her anyway, but it calmed me down a little. I continued to Site C and saw a tent set up there. I really didn't want to disturb anyone, but I thought I might go over and introduce myself as the camping neighbor from Site E, just to see if anyone there looked like the person I had seen earlier. As I got closer, I saw a couple sitting at a picnic table. Neither of them looked like they could have been the person I saw. I introduced myself, and they introduced themselves as well. They were both in their mid-30s, very nice, and seemed pretty drunk but calmly drunk. I didn't ask about the walking person or the squeaking noise because I thought that might seem weird. I wished them a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back, I smoked a cigar and had a few more drinks. It got dark and the night started out perfectly. The sky was clear and I could see millions of stars. I felt better about everything that had happened earlier in the day and felt silly about all the excitement. I decided to get some sleep. It had been a long day and I fell asleep almost immediately. Around 2:30 a.m., I was woken by a huge clap of thunder. It started raining heavily, the wind picked up, and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but I don't like being in a tent during a thunderstorm. A pretty big storm was moving over the island, and I started to get worried. The wind was shaking my tent, and the ground shook from the lightning and thunder. I didn't feel comfortable being so exposed in a tent. The storm lasted about an hour before subsiding to a light, steady drizzle. I was just about to fall back asleep when I heard the squeaking sound again. I snapped my eyes wide open and lay still. There was another loud squeal, this time quite close. I knew there were no really dangerous animals on Rock Island. There are deer and porcupines, but no bears or wolves. Still, I didn't feel any better. There was something about this squeal I didn't like. I say squeal because that's the best description I have for it. It sounded to me like the squeal of a pig. I don't know much about pig noises, but that was the thought that came to my mind when I heard it. Maybe an injured or angry pig. I continued to lie in my tent and began to hear footsteps outside. It was still raining, so the sounds were masked a little by the rain, but it definitely sounded like a fairly large animal or a human walking around. I sat up in my tent and grabbed a knife just to feel a bit safer. In my head, I kept repeating, "It's just an animal, it's okay, there's nothing out here that can harm you." I listened as the footsteps moved away from my tent. I sat motionless, gripping my knife tight for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else. Finally, I thought to myself, "It's okay, it was just an animal, you're overreacting and you need sleep." I was just about to lie back down when suddenly a very loud squeal was heard right in front of my tent. It felt like my heart stopped, and a shiver ran down my spine. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my whole body, even In my ears, it took everything I had to call out loudly and firmly, "Go away." I didn't scream it, but said it with a serious, firm voice, as confident as I could be in that moment. After that, I heard no more noises, no squealing, no footsteps, but I couldn't sleep any more either. I just sat in my tent, staring into the void, waiting. After about an hour, I lay down but stayed awake until the rain stopped and the sun came up. The whole time I tried to calm myself down and convince myself it was just an animal. Around 7:00 a.m., I finally decided to come out of my tent to relieve myself. When I went out, I saw that my picnic table was knocked over and turned upside down. When I saw that, I surprisingly calmly thought, "Okay, that's enough. I'm leaving the island today." I checked my surroundings, but everything else seemed normal. Eventually, I convinced myself that the wind had blown the table over during the storm, although it seemed strange to me since the table was quite heavy and I should have heard the noise. But I told myself it made sense. I made myself some cold, instant coffee, ate a little something, and started to feel a bit better. Then I decided to do the hike I had originally come to the island for, the 7-mile Thordarson Loop Trail hike, which offers many interesting sights. I packed a few things in my backpack and set off. Near my campsite is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked or why it was built as a tower, but it is an impressive building. Inside, there is a fireplace where it looked like someone had recently made a fire. A little further up the path is a cemetery where two sisters and some others are buried. It is suspected that more people lie here in unmarked graves, probably some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries, one on the beach where Chester Thordarson is buried, one on the east of the island where the two sisters are buried, and one in the north where the original lighthouse keeper David E. Corbin was buried. There is also at least one Potawatomi burial site on the island, but no one knows exactly where it lies. I continued along the path until I came to a nice viewing platform with a bench. I sat down there and drank some water. While sitting there, I heard voices on the path ahead of me but couldn't see anyone. There was a bend in the path and the trees were dense, so I waited for these people to come around the bend. The voices got closer, and I realized they weren't speaking English. However, I couldn't identify exactly what language it was. Both voices were very deep and sounded guttural. Suddenly, I heard a loud, rapid "oh" in the woods. Immediately, the voices I had heard responded with their own similar sounds. I had to smile because it sounded like the two had heard something in the woods and tried to imitate it. I stood up, strapped on my backpack, and started walking in the direction the voices came from, but I never found those people. The rest of the hike went smoothly. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin is buried, took a self-guided tour of the Potawatomi Lighthouse, walked past the large wooden gate that used to be part of a larger structure, and viewed the Great Hall and the dock area where I had arrived on the island. I visited some of the other buildings on the island, went to the cemetery where Chester Thordarson is buried, and finally finished the loop hike by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with many sights and not particularly difficult, but I was quite tired. I went down to sightsee to ask the couple how they had spent the night in the storm, but they had already packed their things and left. I was disappointed because I wanted to ask them about the squeaking noises in the night too. The rest of the evening was fairly uneventful. I made a fire, prepared a meal, smoked a cigar, and had a few drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed since I had slept so little. The night before, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep quickly. Maybe I had been asleep for about 3 hours when I suddenly woke up and was immediately wide awake. There was no obvious reason why I had woken up, but I had a feeling something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and at this point, it gets hard to explain. A feeling of utter terror overcame me. It was as if something was in the tent. With me, I could sense it was angry, full of wrath, downright hateful. It felt like something very bad was about to happen and I could do nothing about it. I started shivering uncontrollably. A strong smell of garbage or rotting meat became more and more intense until I felt nauseous. I couldn't move, I was frozen. I had never felt so exposed and helpless. I just stared ahead without seeing anything, completely motionless. The strange thing was that I resigned myself to whatever would happen. It was as if my brain was telling me, whatever happens, even if it is death, it will at least be a relief. And then it went black. At least I think I passed out because the next thing I remember is waking up around 8:00 a.m. When I woke up, I was lying outside my sleeping bag on top of it. My legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was lying on my back with my left leg extended and my right leg bent, with my right foot pressing against my left knee. My heart started to race, but I kept telling myself it was just a dream. I am getting off this island right now. I packed everything up very quickly and headed back to the dock to take the first ferry off the island, since the first ferry from Washington Island doesn't arrive here until 10:30 a.m. I had to spend some time near the Great Hall and the dock area. I wanted to leave the island as soon as possible, but felt a little better because I was out of the woods and near other people. I sat on a bench a little east of the dock and lit a cigar to keep myself busy and not think about the past night. I sat there few minutes looking over the water when suddenly someone spoke to me from behind with hello. I was startled and embarrassed when the person came around the bench and said, sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you smoking and just wanted to ask if you have a lighter." I felt like an idiot and told him it was okay. I explained that I had slept poorly and was a bit lost in thought. I gave him my lighter. He thanked me, lit a cigarette, and gave me the lighter back. We started a normal conversation about the usual things one discusses. He told me he was from the Madison area. We talked about the storm we had experienced, and he seemed like a real outdoorsy guy who had plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice conversation that distracted me a little from the night. Before, he seemed like a pretty likable guy. Naturally, he then asked me which campsite I had stayed at. I told him I had been at Site E for the last 2 nights. He said he usually books that spot, but I must have reserved it before him. He said that's why he had booked Site D for the last 2 nights. That surprised me because when I had walked past Site D, I hadn't seen a tent or any gear. I told him that, and he explained that he comes to the island often, has to book a spot, but actually camps in different places on the island. I asked him where he camps, and he said he mostly camps in the cemetery on the east of the island. Sometimes, though, also in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me he once found the ruins of a small log cabin in the woods and wants to camp there if he finds it again. At this point, I started to change my mind about him and wanted to change the subject. But then he asked me if I heard the screams in the woods. I hesitated to answer because I knew he meant the squeaking I had heard. I told him I had heard it and asked if he knew what it was. This time he hesitated with his answer. His facial expression changed as if he was considering whether to tell me something. Then he said, without any emotion in his voice, "A demon lives on this island." Under other circumstances, I would have dismissed this as a joke, but not after the night I had just had. He looked at me and seemed to notice my fear and unease. To my surprise, he laughed briefly and asked if I had seen anything in the night. I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me, as if trying to figure something out. I had the feeling he knew I had experienced something. I was ready to end the conversation, but then he told me that he had seen something in the cemetery last night. His facial expression and mood changed again as if he wanted to confide in me. I didn't want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to, so I asked with a trembling voice what he had seen in the cemetery. He hesitated before answering, and I could tell he was changing his mind. Instead of a direct answer, he looked at me with a hint of empathy and finally said, "It's hard to explain, but if those screams in the woods bother you, you should stay away from the cemetery." I said nothing at first and tried to process his words. Then he added, without context, "Keepers of the flame." He said these 4 words quietly as if they had a special meaning. I looked at my cigar, noticed the ash had gotten long, stubbed it out, and said I was going to the dock to wait for the boat. He nodded and I started walking. After a few steps, he called out, "Hey." I turned around and he just said, "Don't come back here." I turned around again and walked on. I didn't know if that was a warning or just friendly advice, but I took it to heart. I knew I would definitely not return to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked for keepers of the flame in relation to Rock Island. I found 3 possible meanings he could have been referring to. The name of the Potawatomi, the indigenous people who once lived on the island, can be translated as keepers of the flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were sometimes also referred to as keepers of the flame. Additionally, there was a cult in the 19th century that occasionally visited the island and called themselves Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking, and exploring Chester Thordarson's buildings. My humble recommendation, however, is this: don't go to Rock Island. In 2011, I rented a house in El Paso, Texas, and lived there with my 2 sons for a year. It was a nice house with a large backyard for our dogs, 3 bedrooms, 2 living areas, and a 2-car garage, all at a very affordable rental price. The landlord lived right across the street, so he was always nearby if we needed him. Shortly after we moved in, just a few weeks later, I was lying in my bedroom one evening watching TV and relaxing after a long day. I was unemployed at the time, living off a severance package from my previous employer and looking for a new job. My bedroom was directly across from my younger son's room, and my older son's room was right next to mine. Since my oldest son had a disability, I often had to get up in the middle of the night to help him if he needed to use the bathroom. Late one evening, I heard singing through the vents and thought it was my son's girlfriend, who had just moved in with us and had a great singing voice. I planned to talk to my son about it the next morning. When I asked him and his girlfriend about it, they told me they thought the singing was coming from my room. They thought I might have been watching something on TV and turned the volume up so loud that they wouldn't have to hear it. That was strange. The house was old, built in 1959 and laid out in an L shape. On one side of the L were the bedrooms and bathrooms. On the other side, the living room, dining room, kitchen, another room that could be used as an office or guest room, and the garage. All doors and windows were secured with wrought iron. It started with the door from the garage to the house, which we always locked, often being unlocked when we returned, even if we were in the house and had left the door locked. Sometimes I found it locked again when I went into the garage. The house had been renovated with new tiles, carpets, and kitchen cabinets, but in some rooms there were still old-fashioned push-button switches. These switches made loud clicking sound when you pressed them to turn the light on or off. The light in the guest bathroom began to turn on by itself at night, but only when we were awake. For example, we would be sitting in the living room, hear the switch click, and see that the light in the bathroom was on, even though no one was nearby. There was no explanation for it. Shortly after we moved in, my brother came over to help me connect my devices to a new Wi-Fi modem. When he was done, it was already dark outside. He asked where the bathroom was, and I told him it was the first door on the left in the hallway. I heard him go in, operate the light switch, and heard the sound of him relieving himself. The house wasn't big, you could hear everything. Suddenly there was that loud clicking sound again, and my brother shouted, "What is that?" He came out of the bathroom, and I explained to him that we had all experienced this and it happened regularly. As we settled further into the house, I bought a touch-sensitive lamp for the small table next to my son's hospital bed. The lamp was practical because I could simply tap it if he called me at night. 1 tap for dim light, 2 for brighter light, 3 for brightest light, and the 4th time the light went off. About a week after the purchase, however, this lamp began to turn on by itself, always between midnight and 2:00 a.m., and always on the medium brightness setting. My son, who had limited mobility in his arms due to his disability, could not possibly reach the lamp himself as it stood on the left side of his bed, out of his reach. Despite my efforts to stay awake and catch the moment the lamp turned on, I never succeeded. I often sat in my bed with the door open, watching the hallway, and as soon as I closed my eyes for a moment, the lamp was already on when I opened them again. Finally, I downloaded a ghost hunting app on my iPhone to run some tests. I searched for electromagnetic fields, EMF, in the house and found that the highest readings were measured in my son's room. My brother, who was visiting that evening, thought it was probably due to the electrical wiring in the walls. To test this, we turned off the power at the main breaker box and checked the room again, but the EMF readings remained high even without power. One night, my girlfriend stayed with me. After we went to bed, I left the door to my room open so I could hear my son if he needed me. Suddenly, I woke up because she screamed. She said someone was standing at the door. When I looked, I recognized a shadow figure in the door frame. My heart raced and I get goosebumps while writing this. I jumped out of bed and saw the figure move to the left and disappear into the hallway. I followed it and saw it go into the bathroom, the same bathroom where the light turned on by itself. With trembling hands, I turned on the light, but the room was empty. My girlfriend was so frightened that she couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning, she packed her things and moved out. The following day, I decided to talk to my landlord. I told him about the strange events, and he told me that the woman who had lived there before had died in the house. He had bought the house after her death and converted it into a rental property. I was his first tenant. When I told him about the incidents, he suggested renting a camera to record things in my son's room, but since no one had been hurt and the apparition didn't seem malicious, I decided to leave things as they were for now. Over time, we got used to the strange occurrences, doors locking or unlocking by themselves, the bathroom light turning on and off, and the lamp in my son's room always lighting up between midnight and 2:00 a.m. It almost became normal, even if it occasionally scared us. One night was particularly strange. It was summer in El Paso, and the nights were hot. I had the air conditioning and the ceiling fan on while I slept. Suddenly, I was woken by a quiet rattling of the vertical blinds. I thought it was just the draft from the fan, closed my eyes again, and tried to continue sleeping. But then I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. An eerie feeling came over me, and I thought to myself, "Don't look." At the moment I thought that, I felt a breath right on my right ear, followed by a clear whisper, "Mother." I jumped out of bed, screamed, and turned on the light, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Meanwhile, I had a new girlfriend who had 3 children. When our relationship became more serious, I set up the room previously used as an office as a guest room. There was a bunk bed and a small bed for her youngest daughter. She and her children began to stay with us on weekends, and they too soon experienced strange things. Most often, the little daughter saw the shadow figure. She was so afraid that she often ran into our bedroom in the middle of the night and climbed into bed with us. Everyone in the family began to call the apparition the shadow, and we all had encounters with him at some point. Sometimes when I sat in the living room watching TV, I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I turned around quickly and could often see a dark figure moving away in a fraction of a second. It was as if it was there for just a moment and then disappeared. As our one-year lease was coming to an end, I contacted the El Paso Paranormal Society to have the house investigated. I called and wrote an email via their website, but I got no answer. Finally, we moved out and bought a house in the same neighborhood, just 3 streets away. Shortly before our move, the Paranormal Society finally got in touch and was very interested in investigating the house. They wanted to schedule an appointment in about 2 weeks. I explained to them that we would already have moved out, and the man on the phone told me I should do something important when finally leaving the house. I should loudly announce that the presence must stay in the house and is not allowed to follow us. These words gave me goosebumps, but I agreed. On the evening when my wife and I took the last things out of the house, we did a final walkthrough. We turned off the lights and locked the doors. Our landlord had asked us to leave a light on, and we decided on the kitchen because the kitchen window with the vertical blinds faced the driveway, making it look like someone was home. As we finally got into our cars and rolled down the windows to talk to each other, I remembered the paranormal investigator's advice. I got out, went back to the front door, opened it, and said loudly, "Whatever is in this house, this is your house now. You are not allowed to follow us. You must stay here." Then I closed and locked the door. At the moment I walked back to my car and my wife called out to me that we should go. One of the blinds in the kitchen moved to the side right before our eyes, as if someone was looking out. We looked at each other and both said, "Let's get out of here," and so we drove off. I almost forgot to tell one of the creepiest occurrences. One morning I woke up very early. It was about 4:30 a.m. Once again, the damn light in son's room was on. Realizing how important sleep was for him because of his brain injury, I wanted to turn off the light as quietly as possible before it disturbed him. I crept into the room, angry that this had been happening every night for so long. I tapped the lamp twice to turn it off and started to walk out. But when I stopped at the foot of his hospital bed, I said aloud, "If there is anything here, turn this damn light back on." Almost instantly, the light went on. I froze. I hadn't realized that my son, whom I thought was asleep, had woken up. The look of terror on his face shook me to the core. To this day, I have nightmares when I think of that morning and the look in his eyes. After that incident, I unplugged the lamp and put it in the garage. I wanted nothing more to do with it. The house really exists. It is located at 2900 2nd Street in El Paso, Texas. You can find it on Google Maps. It looks like a completely normal house from the outside. You can even see the kitchen window with the vertical blinds through which a blind was pushed aside on our last evening there. After my first post about the house, I was contacted by 2 people who knew the house and the couples who used to live there. I already knew that the woman who lived there had died in the house, but what I didn't know was that she had remained there undetected for more than a week. Finally, neighbors called the police because mail and newspapers were piling up and no one opened the door. The police found the woman dead in the hallway between my son's room and the bathroom, the one with the light that kept turning itself on. I was told that this woman became paranoid and bitter as she aged. She suffered from dementia and became so angry and mean that she alienated her entire family, even her husband, who finally moved out but continued to pay her bills while she lived alone in the house. After the husband's death, she kept his urn with his ashes on the kitchen table, which faced exactly the window through which the blind was moved on our last evening. My son's room was also described to me as the place where this woman, during her dementia, erected a shrine made of salt and papers. On these papers, she had written prayers asking God for forgiveness and love from her family who had left her. Terrifyingly, I was also told that one of this woman's daughters, when she was child, told that she didn't like sleeping in that room at night because she saw smoke coming out of an electrical outlet, the same outlet where my son's touch lamp was plugged in. This house was the first built in this neighborhood in 1959. I wonder what it was built on. There were so many strange occurrences in this house that I have often thought about writing a book about it. I conducted many experiments to gather evidence, including dusting the metal dome of the touch lamp with flour to see fingerprints. I stretched threads across the carpet at the entrance to my son's room to register movements, but I never got any proof. Years have passed since I lived there. The house is near my son's mother's house, and every time I drive into the area, I take a detour to drive past it. New tenants live there who moved in shortly after I moved out. I often wonder if they have also had experiences. Ghosts are real. Hauntings are real. I believe this firmly, especially because my son and I both had near-fatal accidents which perhaps made us more susceptible to the things in this house. The story is true. The house really exists, but I see no reason ever to return there to find anything out. My family owns a property in the middle of nowhere. On the property stands a very old cabin, very old. It has stood there for at least 2 generations. The story we were told was that the people who lived there were the daughter of a local indigenous chief who was banished from her tribe because she had married a white man, which was extremely frowned upon at the time. It was said the chief felt bad about having to banish his daughter, so he gifted her and her husband land just outside their village. I think her husband died somehow, and if I remember correctly, the story was that she was heartbroken and lonely, and cursed the house after being refused re-entry into her tribe after he died. I am not a believer in curses, and although I always loved the story, I never really took the old tale my grandparents told us seriously. The cabin, however, I never liked. I am now over 40 years old, and when a family member asked if we would celebrate my wedding on the property, and if I would go into the cabin alone or let my children go in, I replied, absolutely no way will I ever set foot in that damn place again or let them go in. I am far from the only family member who feels this way. My whole life the cabin has felt dark and strange. No matter what time of day you went in, others have described this feeling as a heaviness, and that hits the nail on the head. A dark, eerie heaviness. Even on the brightest sunny days it felt that way. There were always tons of dead flies around the windows and old antique furniture everywhere. I feel uncomfortable as soon as I step through the old screen door. There was never an obvious reason for it, so I attributed it to my overactive imagination. When I was in my 20s, I went to the property with my girlfriend during the summer holidays. There were many people there, and although there were several trailers, caravans, and motorhomes, sleeping places were limited. So I decided I should stop behaving like a coward and tried to overcome my fear of the cabin. I went inside with our bags, threw them on the sofa in the bedroom, and prepared one of the beds for myself while my girlfriend prepared the other bed for herself. We spent the evening talking, roasting marshmallows by the campfire, and having fun. When it got quite late, we went into the cabin to go to bed. My girlfriend is hilarious, and we always laugh incredibly much when we are together, so we weren't tense or anything like that. We were lying on our beds, chatting and laughing, when suddenly we heard scratching noises, and my girlfriend got scared. I explained to her that it was a cabin and there were certainly mice, and that she should simply ignore them. She endured about 2 more rounds of the scratching noise before she jumped onto my bed with me. That was fine by me because I didn't feel completely comfortable in the cabin either. We lay there listening to the noises so I could explain to her exactly what we were hearing since I was used to mice in some areas there. We heard scratching again, and I told her it was just the mice looking for food, which calmed her down a tiny bit. Suddenly, we heard a banging in the walls and in the living room. There is a bathroom and a small hallway between the bedroom and the living room, and that is by far the creepiest area of the cabin. I can't explain why. My girlfriend was so frightened that I said I would turn on the light in the bedroom so we could hopefully see or figure out what was causing the noises. To avoid accidentally stepping on a little mouse, I jumped from the bed onto the sofa next to the door and the light switch. I quickly found the switch and turned on the light. We quickly scanned the room for any signs, well, for anything possible, really. We couldn't see anything. I told her it must have just been mice that ran away when I jumped. I turned the light switch off and waited to hear noises again so I could quickly turn the light back on and see something. It only took a few seconds until we heard a banging in the room and a clattering in the living room. I turned the light back on and laughed because again we couldn't see anything. I got off the sofa and my bag flew off the sofa across the floor. My girlfriend screamed and I said, "Screw this," while grabbing her and running out. As we ran past the bathroom and into the living room, I saw that all the old antique furniture was turned over, and it looked like someone had thrown everything across the room. I told my girlfriend nothing of this. We ran into the kitchen to the screen door, and suddenly the thought occurred to me that maybe my uncles were playing a prank on me since they loved things like that. As we approached the screen door, I noticed that the hook was still latched and there was no other way in. The door behind it was also still locked, so we ran to my parents' trailer and told them what happened. My father went back to the cabin with me to look at the furniture, and everything was back in its place. I can't explain it. I don't know what it was or why it happened. I don't know if they believed me or if any family member believes me except my brother, who feels the same way about the cabin as I do, but I don't care. My girlfriend Jamie knows what happened, and I do too, and I will never go back into that cabin. Years later, we talked about it once. She looked at me and asked, "Did you see the furniture lying all over the place?" I don't know if it's comforting to know that she saw it too. Now we have moved to a rural area in a very small town. The house is old, and we hadn't been here long when strange things started happening. On one of the first nights, we had only unpacked a few pots and pans to cook because we were still renovating. We had washed the one pot we used by hand and placed it on a drying mat on the counter. In the middle of the night, I heard a loud noise and then nothing more. I asked my husband to check, but he couldn't see anything. The next morning, I saw the pot on the floor with a huge dent in it. I have no idea how it could have fallen off the counter. There is no sinister presence or anything similar, so I didn't think much of it. But after that, I had several other experiences. One day around 11:00 a.m., I was sitting on my bed with my cat reading. Suddenly my cat, whom I had never heard do anything but meow, sat up, looked at the bedroom door, and began to growl and then hiss. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. It was just weird. About 6 months later, I was lying in bed at night again with my dog, a golden retriever named Ryan Reynolds. Yes, that is actually his name, reading to relax and finally fall asleep. I was home. Alone with my children because my husband had to work away. Although we live in a small community with great people who look out for each other, I still felt a bit tense. I was just about to finish my chapter and go to sleep when suddenly I heard someone running in the hallway. Ryan Reynolds jumped up and looked at me. One of my children has autism and some health issues and talks in their sleep. So I thought maybe running could be the next surprise, although running isn't usually their favorite thing. I assumed it was him and worried he might try to leave the house. So I stood up and called his name, but there was no answer. I went past their room and saw that both children were sleeping soundly in their beds. There was absolutely no sign that they had moved. Both were lying in that typical, completely relaxed, deep sleep position across their beds. The dog ran into the living room, but there was nothing there. Now comes an experience I can't really describe or explain. Again, I was lying in bed at night when I heard a strange knocking. It's crazy to say this, but it sounded like a heartbeat. It wasn't very loud, but definitely audible. I woke my husband up and asked him if he heard it. He said he heard it too, and he is a big skeptic regarding anything paranormal. I asked him what it could be, and we couldn't figure it out. We searched for it and noticed it got louder in the guest room next to our children's room. It got louder and louder the closer you got to the shared wall. The strangest thing was that there were absolutely no noises in their room. Nothing. Then we heard another strange sound that sounded almost like breathing. It sounded like the house was inhaling and exhaling. We couldn't figure out where it came from or what it could be. My husband went back to bed, and I stayed awake listening to this strange heartbeat sound along with the breathing sound. It was a mild night with no wind. We never heard it again after that. My neighbors told me that their friend who lived here died of cancer years ago. She sounded like a fun person, so now when I'm alone, I sometimes talk to her and ask her to help me with the housework instead of moving things or making lights flicker. That would be much better. Maybe wishful thinking on my part. My son refuses to stay alone in the living room. He says someone is watching him. He says they don't seem mean. But he just doesn't like it. I guess time will tell if it's just our imagination playing tricks on us or not. This is an actual experience I had, and it scares me to this day. As I was growing up, I had several small paranormal experiences. I was always very skeptical, so I considered the experiences I had to be real, and I tried my best to explain them, but I couldn't. Many of these experiences even happened in the presence of family or friends, so I knew I wasn't imagining it. As a teenager, I started getting a little too interested in the paranormal, since I wasn't afraid of anything. I sometimes got a little overconfident. At some point, I suspect, I started messing with things I was better off having nothing to do with. It got too intense for me. I talked about the things that were happening, mentioned ghosts, or tried to talk to presences, beings I couldn't see. As I call it, this stirred everything up. As a teenager, I had a friend who sometimes suddenly drifted off in the middle of a conversation and said something strange that sounded creepy and made no sense. Then he would come back to himself and have no idea what he had said. He often said, "No idea what you're talking about," and continued the conversation normally as if nothing had happened. Usually it ended there. But when we were about 15, during one of these trance moments on the phone, he went further. He said something like, "Follow the tracks to the right and then right again. At the end, you will find their resting place." I will describe the environment I lived in because that is important for the next parts. I lived in a pretty nice trailer park off a main road in a small town. It was a heavily wooded area far from the city. The main entrance led right through the middle of the trailer park and ended at the back. A little beyond this cul-de-sac was a slope, and at the bottom of this slope ran a barely used railroad track. To the right of it, it ended in a patch of woods, with one side behind an abandoned old mill and the other side having a dense forest behind a neighborhood. So I followed his strange, cryptic instructions after we ended the call. It was late. Afternoon in the summer. I walked to the railroad tracks and then to the right towards the end. Sometime before I reached the end, I heard footsteps in the woods on my right. Out of curiosity, I climbed up the slope towards the noise. No one was there, but I saw a small cemetery curiously hidden in this patch of woods behind a neighborhood, probably a small family cemetery with graves dating from the early 1700s to the early 1900s. There were only about 20 headstones. I was fascinated and naturally brought my friend there later. He was strangely touched and claimed he had no idea this cemetery existed, but he wasn't the type to lie, so I believed him. The cemetery became one of my favorite places because I was stupid and brave. I went there at night, often until the early hours of the morning, pretending not to be afraid. However, nothing really strange ever happened there. One day, during another conversation, my friend fell into one of those trances again. He said, "Go to the tracks, cross them, and when you get into the woods, you will see him." My overconfident self set off immediately. It was late afternoon again. This time I went to the tracks behind the trailer park, crossed them and walked through a patch of woods that led to a clearing. To the left was an old mill, another one, since it was an old mill town. To the right were miles of cuts for power lines running through the woods supplying the scattered neighborhoods in the area. Straight ahead across the road from the mill lay a denser patch of woods. I followed his instructions again and walked towards the tree line. The moment I entered the woods, I heard the cracking of branches. I immediately saw a black silhouette or the outline of a man dressed entirely in black sitting on a black horse galloping through the woods, away from me and disappearing to the left into the trees. I was shocked because it was absolutely uncommon to see horses in my town. Brave and curious, I decided to go where he had come from, right to the edge of the tree line. There, along the power line cut, I found the remains of an old collapsed horse stable. There was nothing else nearby. The nearest neighborhood was about a mile away in the direction he had disappeared. Fascinated and a little frightened, I called my friend and told him about it. The next day I brought him along to show him my find because he didn't want to believe me. I even began to suspect that he was pretending not to know anything. The most incredible thing happened then. As we walked to the tree line where I had seen the rider the day before, we both saw him. He took the path as before. It was bright daylight and visibility was clear. There was no way we had imagined it. We were both pretty frightened but continued on our way. And I showed him the stable. The strangest thing of all was that I later brought a few more friends to show them the stable. Every time he appeared to us again, the rider on his black horse, following the same path. After finding the stable and continuing to spend a lot of time at the cemetery, the small encounters began to intensify. TVs and stereos turned on by themselves, often in the presence of friends or family. There were intense feelings of being watched and moments of unexplained fear and terror. I heard conversations or music as if from a radio playing in another room, even though I was home alone. There was no one near my house that I could have heard. Things suddenly and violently flew across the room. Fresh handprints appeared in the fogged bathroom mirror after a shower. I heard the distinct sounds of my mother coming home, opening the door, throwing her keys on the table, and opening and slamming the cupboards and fridge while making herself something to drink. She was not a quiet person, yet when I walked out of my room to talk to her, no one was there. One night around 2 or 3 a.m., I got bored and decided to go to the cemetery, although I felt watched and extremely uncomfortable. I wanted to stay stubborn and refused to be afraid. Maybe I was just rebelling. I told myself nothing could happen to me. When I reached the cemetery, everything was normal and quiet. I stayed there for a while until I realized I was acting stupid, so I decided to go home and sleep. I walked back along the tracks towards my home. When I reached the spot where I had to climb up the slope to get into the trailer park entrance, I suddenly heard a rustling. I looked up and saw the rider on his black horse looking down at me from above. He was pitch black, almost like a shadow in the darkness, and yet you could make out the contours of everything. Nothing reflected light. I stared at him for a few seconds, completely shocked and in disbelief. The horse made that typical noise with its lips, and I snapped out of my trance. I turned around and ran down the slope along the tracks. As I ran, I heard the hoofbeats behind me. I turned into the woods at a flatter spot near the trailer park and weaved through the trees to slow him down. Finally, I reached the street and ran to the trailer where I lived, which was at the front end of the park. I jumped through the door, raced inside, and slammed it shut behind me, right through the screen door. My mother was at work, so I turned on all the lights, TVs, and radios in the house to make it as loud and bright as possible, hoping that would ward off anything, even though I knew it probably wouldn't help. I sat on the couch and waited for my mother to come home. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up when she finally came home, and daylight began to stream in. I told her everything, and she told me I shouldn't mess with such things. She believed me because she often had experiences herself and told me about them regularly. When the sun had finally risen, I went back to the spot on the slope where I had seen him to find out if I had just imagined it all or if there might be an explanation, like a real horse in the area, which was unlikely. I just wanted to find something that made sense. I found hoofprints in the sand at the top of the slope, and only there. That was the moment I decided it was too much for me. Although I am not normally religious, I began to pray that it would stop and swore I would stop playing with such things. Everything finally calmed down, and when I turned about 18, it stopped completely. Since then, I haven't had a single experience. I started a new job that my best friend had gotten for me. He hadn't told me anything about it beforehand. We worked the night shift. 3 days a week, deliveries came, and there were about 6 people on duty. On the other days, there were only 3 of us, sometimes even just 2 if it was quiet. The store had 16 aisles, with aisles 14-16 being way in the back. My first day was a delivery day. I was assigned to aisles 8 and 9 since I was new and these were easier. Someone was working next to me in aisle 10. While I was working, I saw out of the corner of my eye a black shadow or mass scurry past quickly. I found this strange since the direction it went was a dead end. There was nothing there. I thought it was the other worker because he was dressed completely in black. When I was finished, I went to aisle 10 and saw him sitting on the floor working on the lower shelves. I asked if he had walked past a few minutes ago, and he said no. I went to aisle 2 where my friend was working. I told him what I had seen, and he said he had also seen shadows but didn't want to tell me because he wanted me to experience it myself and then come to him. He told me he often saw shadows out of the corner of his eye, turned around, and they were gone. A few months later, some new people started working there, and they too saw the shadows. They came to us and told us about it, and we hadn't told them anything beforehand so as not to influence them. Once, I and another colleague were working. My friend was off, and around 6:00 a.m. we were done with Our tasks, we went to the front to prepare the store for the morning shift. We were talking about the strange things we had experienced, the shadow figures, footsteps, strange noises, when suddenly a loud slap of a plastic bag rang out and a loaf of bread flew off the shelf a few feet away from us. We looked at each other shocked, not really believing what we had just heard and seen. We went over, picked up the bread, put it back, and tried to figure out how it could have fallen. We couldn't. We hit the side of the shelf, stomped on the floor, nothing. Then I slapped the bag with my hand, and it was exactly the sound we had heard. The bread had been knocked off the shelf with force. Then the door knob of the office behind us began to rattle quickly out of nowhere. We were paralyzed with disbelief. It only lasted a few seconds until we heard the front door. The morning manager had arrived. Another time, shortly before midnight, a cashier came up to me quickly and asked if I had knocked on the bathroom door. I said no, since I had just come from the opposite direction and it would have been impossible. She asked where the other colleague was, and I said in aisle 16 way in the back. And my friend was in the office where I had just come from. She hurried past, and the next time I saw her, she had quickly clocked out and left. My friend later told me that she went into the office and wanted to see the camera footage in front of the bathroom from about 10 minutes earlier. He was a night manager like me and our other colleague, so he had access to the system. He rewound and told me that something strange had happened. They saw her go into the bathroom, then the image cut to static for about a minute, then she was seen coming out in a hurry. The minute that was missing was exactly the time she had heard 3 loud knocks on the bathroom door. Another time we had power problems. The lights in the store dimmed, not as bright as usual. There were only 3 of us that evening. I was assigned aisle 16, which I hated because the lighting was poor and the back corner of the store was generally creepy. Around 2:00 a.m., my friend came to pick me up since we always took a break at that time. While we were talking and I was cleaning up, we heard a rattling right next to us in aisle 15 and then a growl. Even remembering it gives me goosebumps. We gasped in fright, looked at each other with mouths wide open, and ran. We ran past our other colleague who asked what happened. We told him, and he said that earlier in the night when he was getting his stuff for aisle 12, he felt like he had been pushed and heard a laugh nearby. He didn't want to tell us because he thought we wouldn't believe him, just like we didn't want to tell him about our experience. All 3 of us went into the office to watch the aisle 15 camera. What we saw made our blood run cold. We saw a shadow mass against the shelves that looked like it was crawling sideways along the shelves like Spider-Man on a wall. We stayed together all night and helped each other with the work. I'll end here, otherwise, this story will never end. The 3 of us were in the basement one night, putting things away, talking and laughing. The stairs to the basement were old and loud. You could easily hear if someone was coming down. We were the only ones in the store when suddenly our colleague told us to be quiet and pointed to the stairs. He was closer to them than we were. We fell silent and listened. We heard heavy footsteps, almost as if someone with boots was slowly coming down the stairs. We were stunned and stared at each other in silence as the footsteps came closer and stopped just before the last step where we could have seen who it was. We went over together, looked around the corner. No one was there. I don't work there anymore, and from people I know who still work there, I know that the night shift was completely abolished because no one was willing to take it anymore. I am a skeptic, which is why this story has confused me for years, even though I experienced it myself. When I was in middle school, about 10 years old, a friend of mine came over like almost every Saturday to spend time with me. He was one of my best friends, and we were both pretty observant of our surroundings, so we were quick to point out strange things to each other. At the time, my sister had a small, realistic baby doll that could crawl on all fours if it had batteries. I myself had never paid much attention to it, other than the fact that I found it fascinating that it could blink if you tilted it in the right direction. One day, when we entered the playroom of my house, we found the doll exactly in the middle of the room. At the time, we didn't think much of it since I had seen it many times before without anything special happening. I did, however, have the fleeting thought that it was strange that it was taken out even though my sister hadn't played with it for years. Otherwise, I took the doll and threw it with force against the wall so that it crashed into the nearby toy chest. My friend, whom we will call Jay, liked to switch between playing inside and outside, so we went outside. Everything was fine and normal until we returned to the house. Jay suddenly froze for a few seconds as we entered the hallway to the playroom. I quickly followed his gaze and saw the electronic doll crawling straight down the hallway towards us. That was the main function of the toy, but because of its age and heavy use, it wobbled back and forth as it came towards us. I looked at him and we had the same immediate thought. It must be my sister. It had to be because the old leaking AA batteries that were in the doll would have made it impossible for it to move. We both walked forward and picked up the doll, which emitted the squeaky crying sound activated by squeezing. We called for my sister, but there was no answer. Confused, we searched the whole house for her. It turned out she was still asleep and hadn't been near the doll all day. I want to emphasize that my family is not the kind of family that plays pranks on each other, especially not with creepy things like dolls. This unsettled Jay and me a little, so we carefully placed the doll under a pile of toys in the playroom and left it there. For the next few weeks, there were no further incidents while we played. One weekend, however, Jay and I were sitting at my family's dining table. He was sitting opposite me. Behind me was the living room, which had a few sofas and two huge bookshelves. While I was talking to him and drinking a soda, and he was taking a sip of his soda, he suddenly spat the soda all over the table. This was naturally surprising to me, especially because he usually had a pretty calm personality. I asked him what happened, and he just pointed silently behind me. I turned around and froze when I saw that the doll was sitting on top of one of the huge bookshelves, a good distance behind me and staring at us. We both ran to my mother, who was outside at the time, and asked her if she had placed the doll up there. Note that neither I nor my friend could have reached the top of the shelf since the bookshelves were almost twice as high as we were. We were both horrified when she asked us which doll we were talking about. Since none of my family could have played a prank on us, my father was never home and my friend and I didn't play pranks, we both started to get really scared. Something was wrong with this doll. We asked my mother to get it down for us. Afterward, we took it to the trash cans far in front of the house on my family's yard. For a few weeks, that was the end of the story. We started to forget it until I woke up one morning on a weekend without my friend. I had thought a few times whether Jay could have put the doll in those places, but that morning proved that was not the case. I went into the kitchen, which had a glass door to the front porch. I couldn't move when I saw it. Outside, halfway on the path to the glass door, lay the doll, positioned as if it had crawled towards us, face down on the ground. I told my mother about everything Jay and I had experienced. She is a religious woman who isn't afraid of much, but for some unspoken reason, she doesn't like dolls. She immediately went outside, took the doll, and said she would take care of it. Later, I asked her what she had done with it, and she said she waited until it was dry since it was soaked by rain, burned it, and threw the plastic and electronic remains in the trash. Since then, we had no more incidents, but I wonder to this day what could have caused that if not a member of my family, which would have made no sense at the time. Once again, I am a skeptic, but this story occupies me to this day. The house of my childhood. I was about 8 years old. My older sister was 12 years old at the time. The new house was a building from the late 1800s with meter-thick stone walls, something that is not uncommon here in Germany. Unfortunately, I have no information about the people who built or owned it. I only know something about the people from whom my parents bought it, but more on that later. Was personally always a little skeptical, mainly because I experienced nothing extraordinary in my childhood or youth, but my older sister experienced something. One warm summer day, it was about late July or early August, we were both playing outside. At the edge of our garden, large piles of firewood were stacked to dry. Each pile was about 1.8 meters high and at least 5 meters long. When we took a break from playing, I went into the house to get something to drink while she stayed outside and ran around the woodpiles. When I came back, she looked somehow confused and a bit scared, so I asked her what happened. She said that while I was gone, she saw a head peeking out from behind the woodpiles and moving along the piles. At first, she thought it was our father, a tall man of about 2 meters, as tall as I am today, sneaking up to scare her. So she also crept along the front of the woodpiles, expecting to meet him at the end of the pile. But when she arrived at the end and peered around the corner, no one was there. At that very moment, she felt an incredible cold in the middle of summer with temperatures around 30 degrees Celsius. Our father was with me and my mother in the kitchen the whole time, and our garden was surrounded by a high fence so no one could get in or out. Also, we lived in a small village, and this part of the garden bordered an open field, making it practically impossible to hide. That was probably her first major paranormal encounter. Over the years, she experienced similar things. She saw people who weren't there, heard scratching in the night or the creaking of floorboards as if someone was walking around. If you are interested, the really bizarre things happened to her only recently after she moved into her own house with her husband. As I said, I didn't believe in the paranormal at the time, so I didn't pay much attention to it since I hadn't heard or seen anything. But my mother had experiences, especially at night, since our father almost always worked the night shift. We were often alone at night, which wasn't really a big problem. We had a family dog, a German shepherd, who would have defended us all with his life, so we felt safe enough, especially because, as mentioned, we lived in a very small village. But about 20 years later, my mother told me about some experiences, one of which has particularly stuck in my memory. One night she was unpleasantly awakened by our dog barking at some animal, maybe a rabbit or a hedgehog. That happened sometimes, and since she was a light sleeper, it wasn't unusual. Already awake, she wanted to drink a glass of water and got ready to get out of bed when she, as she described it to me, saw a black shadow sneaking from the hallway into the bedroom. She said it looked like a dark shadow at first, but then began to detach itself from the wall and floor and float into the middle of the room, moving quickly towards her. It floated in the air and had the silhouette of a large ray manta with a faceless head in the middle of the black mass that made up its body. It reached out the fin-like parts of its body towards her. Frozen with fear, she could do nothing, but just as it was about to reach her, the apparition vanished into thin air. She said she remained in a half-sitting position for minutes, shocked, before crawling back under the covers. She didn't drink a glass of water that night. Now to my first encounter, which honestly wasn't that bad but still unsettling. My grandmother passed away in 2004, so my whole family gathered. After the funeral, we sat together in my parents' house and talked. After a few hours, the phone suddenly began to ring violently. It was one of those cordless phones that sit in a base station. It wasn't a normal ring, but many tones in rapid succession, something I had never heard before. My mother took the receiver from the station, answered the call, but only static noise could be heard. Also, no incoming call was registered. Strange, the same night I felt the blanket being pulled an inch off my shoulder, and afterwards a warm hand was placed on it. I knew I was alone in the room, the door was closed, but I didn't feel frightened or afraid. It was really nice, and from the bottom of my heart, I knew it was my grandmother saying goodbye to me. Similar things happened to almost all close family members on that day. My attitude changed, and I became a believer. I moved to London, but previously I lived in a 1950s house in Hampshire, UK. My parents had bought it in 1999 from an elderly couple who had lived there since it was built, so no one had died there. The first odd thing was that our cats didn't want to stay in the house. For some reason, they always ran outside. After my parents started renovations, my brother and I felt watched in the house. Especially at night. In the living room, you always had the feeling that something was staring at you through the new glass doors from the hallway or the stairs. After a while, when we were sitting downstairs, we heard footsteps moving from my bedroom upstairs into my brother's room next door, and then across the hall into my parents' room. My parents dismissed this as noises from pipes or settling floorboards, but you could hear exactly which boards the footsteps walked on. Once, friends came to visit. I was home alone, and as they walked down the street, they could look into our living room. They asked if relatives were visiting us because they had seen people sitting on the sofa. Then things started to move. Shoes placed by the door were suddenly under the stairs. Keys were found in other places, but then it got really creepy. One day I had run a bath and was listening to music on the computer in the study next door. After a while, the music stopped because the PC had gone into standby mode. I was in the bath for about an hour and had fallen asleep when the water had already almost reached my nose. Suddenly, the music on the PC turned back on and louder than before. It woke me up. Back then, you had to either press the keyboard or move the mouse vigorously to wake the computer from standby mode. I assumed that perhaps my life was saved by this, which led me to believe that whatever was in the house meant no harm. A few weeks later, I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night as if something had woken me. It was around 2:00 a.m. My door was open to the hallway, and it was a full moon whose light illuminated the hallway. To my horror, I saw an old man. He wasn't standing, but it looked as if he was lying on the stairs. His head was at foot level. He stared directly at me. The moonbeams illuminated his face. This image haunts me to this day. I immediately closed the door and slept the rest of the night with the light on. My parents sold the house in 2004 when they moved to New Zealand. Later, when I talked to my father about it, he said he knew something was in the house. He just didn't want to scare us kids. He had had his own experiences. He had heard the same footsteps on the floorboards. In the mornings, when he was making tea for my mother, he heard footsteps behind him in the kitchen coming towards him. Sometimes he felt something rush past him, and the taps turned on by themselves. Years later, when I told him about the old man I had seen, he said he had seen the same man several times in the reflection of his reading glasses. The man was sitting in the armchair behind him while he read in the living room. My father is a big skeptic, formerly a police officer, and later an uncompromising project manager. He was so troubled that he went to the archives to find out what our house was built on. He found out that in Victorian times the area consisted of large manor houses and their estates. It looked as if our kitchen had been built over an old path leading from the main house to an ice house. My father suspects that perhaps it was servants or other people using this path. Very creepy. This is not my story but my father's, but I think it is worth telling here. My father was a construction worker and was contracted by the local council in the UK to carry out work on council buildings. This included houses and apartments. My father was informed that his next job would take place in an apartment building with several rooms and 3 floors. Such buildings where no one lives at the time are referred to as voids, empty buildings without residents. When this happens, the council installs heavy metal doors to keep burglars out. To gain access, you need a set of keys provided by the council. To get a head start, my father wanted to get an overview of the scope of work he would be undertaking instead of arriving unprepared. So he opened the building and looked around. 4 rooms. On the ground floor, 4 more on the first floor, and another 4 on the second floor, all connected by a stairwell. In the center of the stairwell was an open shaft through which you could see up to the ceiling on the 3rd floor. There were metal railings for protection. It was a big job, but doable in a few days. Clear out the building, replaster a few walls, and paint. My father wanted to lock up when he suddenly had the feeling that someone was standing behind him. He told me that this was not unusual. Often residents see construction workers go into empty buildings and want to see what they can take. So my father turned around and said, "Mate, you have to leave, I'm locking up now." But he said it to no one. No one was behind him or in the building. He thought it was just a strange feeling, thought nothing more of it, locked up and went home. My father told my mother what happened, but rather casually, something like, "That happened today, kind of weird," and that was it. It wasn't discussed further. On Monday, my father and his friend Martin went back to work. They opened the building and started working. A resident came by and asked how it was going. Both agreed that everything was going well. After a few trivial words, the resident changed the subject. "It's really a shame what happened there, isn't it?" My father and Martin were confused. "Shame? What is a shame?" the man replied. "The poor girl came home from school a few months ago and saw her father hanging. He had tied himself to the railing and jumped. Naturally, my father got goosebumps and felt that familiar shiver running up his spine. He didn't tell the resident what he had felt, but he reported it to Martin. The two decided that neither of them would ever go into the building alone. They also agreed to always leave the central door open to have an exit in case of emergency. My father would be the first to say that he doesn't really believe in ghosts, and he would also say that he never saw a ghost, but he admitted that this was the strangest experience he ever had and that he cannot explain it to this day. As long as I can remember, I could never escape the paranormal. Whether it was the TV turning on by itself at night as a child or imaginary friends that my older sister and I could both see for years. I almost got used to unusual things happening. Of all the things that came and went in my current home, there is a presence that has been there as long as I can remember, and he is quite peculiar. For simplicity, I'll just call him the old man. You often hear him walking through the basement, mostly in the additional living room connected to another guest room. He has never spoken a word to us. It seems as if he really didn't like my mother's best friend. When she lived with us for a short time, he banged on the walls of the laundry room when she was alone. She swore up and down that he told her to get out. No one else was ever told the same thing. Usually, we got at most a whisper calling our names, and who knows if that even came from him. That was always puzzling to me. Personally, I think the old man is okay. He was always quiet towards my family, never moved things or bothered us. I only saw him briefly occasionally, but the description I have of him matches what everyone else in the house has seen of him. Everyone except my mother's friend agrees pretty much that he is harmless. My room was located in the guest room connected to the living room in the basement. Often I came home after school when no one was there and slept for a few hours while waiting for someone to come home. Sometimes I was so tired because I had stayed up too late and had to get up so early that I fell asleep with the light on. In these cases, I woke up 90% of the time and found that the light had been turned off for me. No one in my family ever admitted to having done this, and my parents would really not be the kind of people to turn off the light for me to sleep since they found my disturbed sleep rhythm frustrating. With my siblings, who were mostly not there at the time, it was also unlikely that they would lie about turning off the light for me, so I can only assume that the old man was the one who helped me with the light. I have always wondered if he might be a kind of guardian. The way he behaved towards my mother's friend, however, contradicts this idea. She is by no means a bad person or would have deserved something like that. However, I cannot even say for sure if the old man was actually responsible for what happened to her since she never saw him when the walls banged. It makes me think about how many of you have had similar experiences with a presence that is hostile towards some and calm and friendly towards others. It remains a mystery why such beings behave so differently. Maybe it has to do with us, with what we radiate, or it could simply be something we will never fully understand. My grandmother was able to warn us in a very special way if something was going to happen. I always listened to her when she told me ghost stories about family members, but found them only entertaining. I was skeptical, but listened to her anyway. We lived in an apartment where there was activity, but we just ignored it. When we moved into a larger apartment owned by my uncle, my grandmother and I were getting her yarn bags when she suddenly stopped and looked uneasy. I asked her if everything was okay, and she told me that there was something in the building that didn't want us to stay there. Since I was the skeptic that I was, I just replied, "Well, it's a bit late for that now." Later, I would regret making fun of it. It was shortly before Christmas 1996, and in my mother's apartment. If you entered the couch area, you could look directly into the kitchen. She was just watching her favorite movie, It's a Wonderful Life, the black and white version. I was bored and only half paying attention to the TV when I suddenly saw something out of the corner of my eye fly past her door. I looked and thought, as always, that I was just overtired. But then it went